He burned down everything he built and called it the best decision of his life. A man with a stolen name, a woman with a ranch she'd bleed to keep, and a secret so big it could swallow an entire valley whole. What happens when the only person standing between a community and total ruin is the same man who designed their destruction in the first place? Stay with me until the end of this story, because nothing about it goes the way you think. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon came in from the east just before noon, rattling down the main road of Ash Hollow with one axle that needed grease and a driver who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. Nobody paid much attention. Wagons came through Ash Hollow all the time. Most of them kept right on going. The town wasn't exactly what you'd call a destination. It had a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Dusty Spur that smelled like old leather and bad decisions, and maybe 24 buildings that ranged from barely standing to structurally questionable. The church had a collapsed back wall that nobody had gotten around to fixing since the spring floods 2 years ago. The schoolhouse only had school when the teacher wasn't laid up with something. What Ash Hollow had going for it was land. Good land, mostly. Wide open grazing territory with creek access and the kind of soil that could grow something if you worked it hard enough. But land only matters if someone fights for it, and lately, the people of Ash Hollow were losing that fight one by one. 3 ranches had sold in the last 6 months. The Burtons sold first, then old Pete Alderman, who'd held out until the lawyers started showing up at his door twice a week. The Caldwell family just packed up and left without telling anyone, and people found their place empty one morning, like a tooth knocked clean out of a jaw. Word moved through the valley the way bad news always does, quietly, fast, and leaving a sick feeling behind it. The man driving the wagon tied off his horse at the livery, paid for a night's stabling, and walked into town carrying a single canvas bag over one shoulder. His name, the one he gave anyway, was Elias Mercer. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the way that comes from actual physical work rather than vanity, with dark hair that needed cutting and 2 days of stubble that had missed the 3-day mark by about a day and a half. His hands, if you looked close enough, told a complicated story. They were calloused now, roughed up at the knuckles. But the calluses weren't old. They were the kind you get when a man who used to sit behind a desk suddenly decides to start using them for something else. There was a scar on his left forearm, thin and straight, the kind a wire fence leaves when you're not paying attention. He walked into the general store and bought coffee, dried beans, a box of ammunition for the revolver he carried without advertising it, and a small wedge of hard cheese that had seen better days but was priced right. He asked Harlan Webb, who ran the store, whether there was any work to be had in the area. Harlan Webb was the kind of man who watched everything from behind a counter and formed opinions quickly. He looked at this stranger for a long moment, the quiet, settled way he stood, the fact that he didn't fidget or fill silence with noise, and decided he was either trustworthy or very good at pretending to be, which in a frontier town often amounted to the same thing. "Ranch work?" Harlan asked. "Any kind. Most places around here aren't hiring. Times are lean." "I don't need much." Harlan wrapped the cheese in brown paper and set it on the counter. "Calloway Place might be looking. Widow woman out on the south road about 4 miles past the creek crossing. Lost her foreman 3 weeks back. He took off for the silver camps up north. She's been running the place short-handed ever since." He paused. "She's particular, though. Doesn't suffer fools." "I appreciate that in a person," Elias said, and meant it. He paid for his goods, tucked the bag under his arm, and walked back out into the thin autumn sunlight. The Calloway Ranch sat on about 400 acres of mostly decent land, with a main house that was solid but plain, a barn that needed paint but not structural work, and a bunkhouse where the hired hands slept when there were any. Right now, there weren't. The place had the quiet of a location that was functioning but only barely. You could feel the strain of it in the leaning fence posts along the east pasture, the water trough that was cracked on one side and losing about 1/3 of what it held, the woodpile that was a few cords short of where it needed to be before winter. Marin Calloway was in the corral when Elias rode up, working with a young chestnut mare that had a bad habit of shying left and a worse habit of putting her shoulder into people when she was nervous. Marin was not small, not delicate, and absolutely not the kind of woman who was interested in anyone's help at that particular moment, which was made clear by the way she kept her eyes on the horse and not on the stranger who'd ridden into her yard. She was 31 years old, though she moved like someone who'd been 31 for a while and found it a reasonably honest age to occupy. Her hair was dark brown and braided back, mostly escaped from the braid at this point, and there was a smear of something, motor grease or mud, hard to tell, along her left jaw that she was unaware of. She wore practical clothes, worn trousers tucked into boots, a collarless shirt, a vest that had belonged to her father. The vest was too big for her across the shoulders, but she wore it anyway. Elias stopped his borrowed horse at the fence and waited. He didn't call out or announce himself. He just waited. After about 2 minutes, during which Marin brought the chestnut around in a figure 8 and spoke to her in a low, flat voice that didn't quite qualify as soothing, but was oddly effective, she glanced over at him. "You selling something?" "No, ma'am. Looking for work?" She turned back to the horse. "Not hiring. The man at the general store said your foreman left." "That's not his business or yours." She brought the mare around again, watching the horse's ears. "And before you tell me you're experienced, everyone who shows up here is experienced. Everyone has 10 years of ranch work under their belt and a reference letter from someone I've never heard of. I've hired 3 men in the last 2 years, and all 3 of them either drank, lied, or left without notice. So, I don't drink," Elias said. "I won't lie to you about my qualifications, and if I leave, I'll give you a week's notice." She stopped walking the horse and looked at him properly for the first time. He was on horseback, so it was hard to get a full read on him, but there was something about the way he held himself. Not aggressive, not eager to please either. Just settled. Like a man who had nothing to prove, which was either the mark of genuine competence or the mark of someone very skilled at performing it. "What's your name?" "Elias Mercer." "Where are you from, Elias Mercer?" A pause. Not long, but there. "Originally Kansas. More recently, I've been working my way west." "Doing what?" "Various things. Ranch work, freighting, some carpentry." Marin handed off the mare's lead to a young boy who materialized from the barn. Her nephew, maybe 14, with her same dark eyes and a serious expression that suggested he took his job as informal stable hand with great seriousness. She walked to the fence and leaned on the top rail, studying Elias from about 6 feet away. This close, she could see that the calluses on his hands were recent. She could see that he met her eyes without flinching and without that particular brightness that men sometimes got when they were trying to charm her. "I pay $12 a month," she said. "Bunkhouse has a stove that works. Meals are taken at the main house, breakfast and supper. You work Sundays until noon, rest of the day is yours. You go through my things, talk back to me in front of anyone, touch my horses rough, or show up to work drunk even once. You're done. No second chances." "That's reasonable," Elias said. "Most men think it's strict. Most men probably needed the second chances." Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but the slight recalibration that happens when someone says something you weren't expecting. She pushed off the fence. "Put your horse in the east stall. Tommy will show you where things go." She glanced at the boy, who was already leading the chestnut back into the barn. "We start at 5 tomorrow morning. There's about 6 things that need fixing before the first hard freeze, and I'd like to get started on them." She walked back toward the house without looking back. Elias sat on his horse for a moment in the empty yard, listening to the wind move through the dry grass at the edge of the property. He'd made a mistake coming here. He knew it even then. It would have been smarter to go further north, find work somewhere no one would think to look, somewhere with no connection to anything he'd left behind. But there was something about the valley when he'd ridden through it. The particular quality of the light in the afternoon, maybe, or the way the land rolled out toward the mountains in a way that looked almost manageable, that had made him stop. And the name Calloway, when Harlan Webb mentioned it, had sat in his chest in a way he hadn't expected, because he knew the name. He'd seen it in a file. He got off his horse and led it toward the east stall, and he put that thought away, in the place where he'd been putting thoughts like that. Deep and dark and sealed, like a cellar door you hammer shut and hope the floor holds. The first week was exactly as hard as Marin had advertised, and then somewhat harder. The fence situation on the east pasture was worse than it looked from a distance. 3 sections had posts so rotted at the base that they were being held up mostly by stubbornness and packed earth, and when Elias pulled the first one, it came apart in his hands like wet paper. He spent 2 full days just pulling and replacing posts before he could start on the wire. And by the end of the second day, his arms were burning from the shoulder down, and he'd given himself 2 new cuts that he wrapped with strips from an old shirt. He worked beside Tommy mostly. The boy's name was Thomas Reyes. He was Marin's nephew, orphaned at 11 when his parents died of fever and absorbed into the ranch with the quiet efficiency of a woman who loved hard but didn't announce it. Tommy was a worker, which Elias respected. He didn't complain and he didn't make conversation for the sake of it, but he asked good questions. "You done fence work before?" Tommy asked on the second day, watching Elias set a new post with the kind of critical eye that belongs only to teenagers and people who've been doing a job for years. "Some. The way you're checking the lean, that's carpenter's habit. Most fence men don't bother." Elias glanced at him. The kid was sharper than he looked, which was saying something because he didn't look dim to begin with. "Worked some carpentry," Elias said. "Old habits." Tommy seemed to accept this. He went back to tamping earth around the base of the post they'd planted. "She'll check your work," he said, "just so you know. She'll come out here in the morning and walk the whole line." "She should. Most hired hands don't like that. Most hired hands have things to hide." Tommy looked at him for a moment with those dark, serious eyes. "Do you?" Elias drove another post into the ground with the fence mallet. "Everybody does," he said. "Question is whether what you're hiding matters." Myron did check his work. She came out on the third morning with her coffee mug and walked the repaired section of fence the way a general walks a battlefield. Unhurried, thorough, stopping at intervals to press a post or test a wire. She didn't say anything while she was doing it. Elias was already starting on the next section, and he kept working. When she walked back past him, she said, "Post spacing is a little wide on the north end." "Yes," he said. "I'll fix it this afternoon. I was waiting to see if we had more 8-footers or if I needed to cut." She stopped. "You noticed." "Before you did." Another one of those small recalibrations. She drank her coffee. "We've got 3 more 8-footers in the barn. Use 2 of them." "Yes, ma'am." She started to walk away, then stopped again. "You can drop the ma'am. My name is Marin. Use it." He nodded and went back to work. She stood there for maybe 3 seconds longer than necessary, then turned and walked back toward the house, and he was careful not to watch her go. The water trough problem turned out to be more complicated than a crack. When Elias drained it to get a proper look at the damage, he found that the crack wasn't the primary issue. It was the secondary one, caused by a slow settling of the ground beneath the trough that had been happening for probably 2 or 3 years. The earth underneath had a buried seam of clay that retained water during the rains and then dried and contracted, causing a slow but consistent movement that had eventually stressed the trough enough to crack it. He spent an afternoon doing something that was not, strictly speaking, fence work or carpentry or the kind of labor a ranch hand normally performed. He dug a test pit 6 inches from the trough's base, examined the soil layers, and worked out a drainage solution involving a shallow French drain running 12 feet east to redirect groundwater away from the clay seam before it could accumulate. He was still digging when Marin came to find him at dusk, which had started coming earlier and earlier. She looked at the pit, then at him. "What is that?" He explained what he'd found. He explained the drainage solution. He used plain language and kept it short. She was quiet for a moment. "That's not something a regular ranch hand would know." "I read a lot," he said, which was true, though not quite the whole of it. She looked at him in the fading light, and there was something in her expression that he didn't like. Not suspicion exactly, but the early ancestor of it. The shape of a question forming that hadn't found its words yet. "Get cleaned up," she said. "Supper's in 20 minutes. Supper at the Calloway Ranch was not comfortable exactly, but it was real. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and it smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the beef stew that Marin made with the practical efficiency she brought to everything. No unnecessary steps, no flourishes, but it was good stew. The table sat 4, and usually it was just Marin and Tommy, which meant Elias made 3 and the 4th chair sat there making the table feel like it was waiting for something. Conversation was sparse the first few nights. Tommy ate with the focus of someone who'd learned early that food wasn't always guaranteed and didn't take meals lightly. Marin ate standing at the counter half the time, reading papers or tallying numbers in a ledger, which drove Elias slightly insane, but which he didn't comment on. On the fourth night, she sat down properly, which felt like an event. "Where were you before you came through here?" she asked, not looking up from her bowl. "Colorado for about 4 months. Before that, Nebraska." "Doing what in Nebraska?" "Freighting. Short haul mostly." He paused. "Grain and dry goods." "You give up freighting?" "I needed a change." She looked up at that. "From freighting?" "From a lot of things." Tommy, who had the instinct of someone who'd grown up reading rooms, quietly focused very hard on his bread. Marin held Elias's gaze for a moment, and he could see the question there. The real one. The one that was actually underneath all the small ones. She was asking, "Who are you, really?" And he held her gaze back, and he gave her nothing, and eventually she looked back at her bowl. "The stove in the bunkhouse burns hot on the left side," she said. "Bank your fire to the right before you sleep, or you'll wake up either frozen or smoking." "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. If you burn the bunkhouse down, I'm docking it from your wages." Tommy made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Elias kept a straight face. But something shifted in the room, just very slightly, barely enough to name, towards something less like wariness and more like the cautious beginning of coexistence. 3 weeks in, the first real crisis. The creek that fed the Cowboy water supply, a small tributary that fed into the main river 2 miles south, dropped almost overnight. It happened after a dry spell that had lasted 10 days, but the drop was more severe than the dry spell alone explained, and Elias noticed it on his morning walk to check the fence extension on the west side of the property. He came back to the house fast, didn't bother knocking, walked straight into the kitchen where Marin was eating breakfast and reading something. She looked up, startled. "You don't walk into my house without—" "The creek's down, significantly. More than the dry spell accounts for." She set down her coffee. "How far down?" 3 inches below where it was yesterday. There's a channel diversion happening somewhere upstream. Someone is redirecting water." Her expression went still in a way that was different from her normal stillness. This was the stillness of someone who'd been expecting bad news and was trying to measure exactly how bad this particular version was. "Is it the Henderson property?" "I don't know who owns upstream from here." "The Henderson property borders the creek about a mile north. They sold last month to some land company. I don't know which one." She stood up from the table. "Show me." They walked out together in the early morning light, and it was the first time Elias had been aware of walking beside her rather than behind her, or at a distance, and he noticed, could not help noticing, that she walked fast and didn't adjust her pace for him, which he found he respected more than he should have. At the creek, she crouched down and looked at the water level, then looked north along the bank. Her jaw was set. "They're diverting it," she said. "Yes. Drought year, that creek is 50% of what keeps this ranch viable." She stood up. "If I lose the water access, I lose the grazing rotation on the north and west pastures. If I lose that—" She stopped. Started again. "If I lose that, I lose maybe 30 cattle by spring, which means I lose enough income that I can't make it through next year." She was talking to herself as much as to him, laying out the math, and the math was ugly. "I can trace the diversion point," Elias said. "If I can find where it's been redirected, it might just be a temporary dam for their use. Some operations do that during drought and release the water after, or it might be permanent. And if it's permanent, then you have a legal issue, not a ranch issue." She turned and looked at him. "Do you know about water law?" "Some," he said carefully. "Prior appropriation doctrine. If your use predates theirs, you have a claim." She stared at him. "That's not something a man who did freighting in Nebraska typically knows." The moment stretched. The wind came down off the hills and moved through the dry grass on the bank and stirred her escaped hair across her forehead, and she was looking at him with those eyes that were exactly the color of dark coffee and twice as sharp. "I told you," he said. "I read a lot." She held the look a beat longer. Then, "Find the diversion point." Check. He found it that afternoon. A rough earthen dam about 3 feet high built across the creek's natural channel, redirecting roughly 60% of the flow eastward into what looked like a newly excavated retention pond on the former Henderson property. The dam was recent, the earth was still dark, and the cut edges were clean. He was standing at the dam taking in the dimensions when he heard a horse behind him and turned to find a man in a good suit, too good for being out here, sitting on a horse that cost more than most homesteaders made in a year. The man was somewhere in his 50s, broad through the chest, with white hair trimmed neat, and the easy manner of someone who'd had things go his way for long enough that he'd stopped thinking about what happens when they don't. He looked at Elias the way a man looks at someone he doesn't consider a variable worth calculating. "This is private property," the man said. "Is it?" Elias said. Not a question. "The Henderson parcel was sold to Meridian Land Holdings last month. You're trespassing." "I'm looking at a dam that's cutting off downstream water access. That's a prior appropriation violation if the Callaway Ranch documented their water use before you built this." The man's expression changed, very slightly, very quickly, and then settled back to casual. But Elias had seen it. He'd seen that kind of expression in a very specific context, in conference rooms and across mahogany tables, and seeing it here on a creek bank in Wyoming felt like looking into a mirror he'd buried. "You a lawyer?" the man asked. "No?" "Then I'd suggest staying in your lane. Ranch hand." He turned his horse and rode back the direction he'd come without another word. Elias stood at the dam for a long time after the sound of the horse faded. The water moved around the earthen wall in the small gap they'd left, a thin thread of what the creek should have been. He thought about the name Meridian Land Holdings and the sick, cold weight of what that name meant, and the particular way the man in the good suit had looked at the dam, not like something he'd ordered built, but like something he was inspecting that had been built according to a plan. A plan drafted somewhere far from this creek. A plan that existed in files Elias had read, in meetings Elias had attended, in decisions Elias had made when he was a different man with a different name going by his actual one. He turned and walked back toward the Callaway Ranch. He told her about this dam. He told her about Meridian Land Holdings. He did not tell her what he knew about Meridian Land Holdings, which was almost everything, because what he knew would require explaining things he had not yet figured out how to explain. "Meridian," she repeated. They were at the kitchen table. Tommy was in the barn for the night. The lamp between them made the room feel smaller and closer than it was. "That's the same company that bought out the Henderson place and the Alderman place and the Burton spread." "Yes. They've been systematically acquiring land in this valley for about 18 months. She had a map spread on the table, hand-drawn, with property lines in pencil. She put her finger on the Henderson parcel, then the Alderman one, then the Burton spread. They formed a rough arc around the south and east portions of the valley. "They're building something," she said. "Not a ranch. Something else." "Probably," Elias said. She looked up at him. "You know what, don't you?" It wasn't entirely a question. Her voice was flat and precise, and her eyes were doing that thing, reading him, finding the edges of what he wasn't saying. "I have a theory," he said carefully. "Tell me." He said, "Railway corridor, the northern route that's been speculated for years. The Meridian Mountain Pass route. If you control the land on both sides of the valley approaches, you control right-of-way negotiation. You can force a favorable deal with the railway company or sell the entire corridor at a premium, but you need contiguous parcels." She looked at the map, looked at the arc of purchased properties, and the Callaway Ranch, she said slowly, sits right in the middle of the corridor. "Yes." The word landed in the room and sat there. "That's why they keep sending lawyers." "Yes." "That's why they're diverting the water. They're not trying to use it. They're trying to pressure me." Her voice was very controlled, which was a kind of anger he recognized as more dangerous than loud anger. "They're cutting off my supply to make the ranch unviable, to force a sale." "That's my read." She looked at him across the table, and the lamplight caught the angle of her face. And she looked like someone who had been fighting a war for a long time and had just learned that the war was bigger than she'd understood. "How do you know all this?" she asked. "About railway corridors and land acquisition strategy and prior appropriation doctrine and—" She stopped. "Who are you, Elias Mercer?" The question landed exactly as hard as it deserved to. He looked at her. He thought about what he was, what he'd been. The name that wasn't his name, the file with Callaway on it in an office in Denver that he'd left behind. He thought about the man on the horse by the dam who looked at things the way Elias used to look at things, like pieces on a board. I'm someone trying to be useful, he said. Right now, to you. She held his gaze for a long, long moment. That's not an answer. No, he admitted. It's not. She sat back in her chair. Outside, the wind had picked up, the first real bite of coming winter in it, and somewhere out in the dark, the horses shifted in the barn, and Tommy's lamp went out in the bunkhouse window. I need you to trace the full extent of their property acquisitions, she said finally. County records at the land office in Tanner Creek. I need to know exactly what they hold, what they're negotiating, and who's left in the valley that hasn't sold. I can do that. And I need that damn dealt with, legally, which means I need someone to document it before they can claim it's been there longer than it has. I'll ride up there tomorrow morning with paper and a measuring line. She nodded once, the decision made, the conversation closed, except that she didn't immediately get up or look away. She stayed sitting there across from him in the lamplight for a moment, with the map between them and the question she hadn't gotten an answer to still somewhere in the air. I appreciate the help, she said at last, and her voice had something in it that was the careful beginnings of more than professional acknowledgement. She stood up, folded the map, set it at the corner of the table. Get some sleep, she said. 5 o'clock. She took her lamp and walked toward the back of the house. He sat in the dark for a minute after she left, listening to the wind and the particular silence of a ranch at night. Horses breathing, wood settling, cold moving through the cracks. He was in the wrong place, and he'd known it since the first day. The longer he stayed, the worse the reckoning was going to be. He knew exactly what Meridian Land Holdings was because he'd built it. Not the day-to-day operations, not the bullying lawyers and the earthen dams, but the strategy. The railway corridor theory, the land acquisition model. The entire framework of what they were doing to this valley had come, in its original and essential form, from him. He should have told her that before she trusted him with her map. He should have told her that before he started caring whether the fence posts were level. He blew out the lamp and walked out to the bunkhouse in the dark, and he lay on the bunk with his eyes open listening to the wind, and he thought about what it would mean to finally be the kind of man whose actions and his identity matched, and how terrifyingly far he still was from that. The trip to Tanner Creek took 2 days there and back, and Elias came back with 8 pages of notes in a tight, precise handwriting that looked, if Marin had thought to notice it, nothing like what you'd expect from a ranch hand. County records confirmed what his theory had suggested, and then exceeded it. Meridian held 21 separate parcels in the valley and the surrounding hills, with 5 more under active negotiation. The Callaway Ranch was one of 3 remaining independent holdings that sat inside the natural boundary of the speculated railway corridor. The other 2 were small, less than 100 acres each, owned by a widow named Pruitt and a young couple named Garza, who'd come out from Texas 2 years ago with not much money and a lot of intention. Elias knew both properties from riding the valley. He knew the Garzas had a new baby and a roof that needed patching. He knew Martha Pruitt kept a shotgun by her door and had already turned away 2 sets of lawyers. He laid all of it out on the table for Marin, and she read through his notes twice without speaking. They're close, she said. Very. If they get the Pruitt place or the Garza place, they can route around us. It'd cost them more, but they could do it. The Garzas are vulnerable, Elias said. Young, cash-poor, new baby. If Meridian offers them enough, they might take it. Not out of greed, just out of exhaustion. I need to talk to them. Yes. She looked up from the notes. You know a lot about all of this. The valley, the properties, the people. She said it neutrally, but it wasn't neutral. You've been here less than a month. I pay attention. You pay attention like someone who's done this kind of work before. The pause before his answer was a half beat too long. I've done a lot of different work, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The question lived between them like an object on the table they both kept not picking up. Ride with me to the Garzas tomorrow, she said. Early. Yes, backhand. The Garza place was quiet when they arrived. The kind of quiet that sits on a house with a new baby in it. The paradoxical hush of people tiptoeing around the loudest possible disruption. Carmen Garza answered the door with dark circles under her eyes and the cautious look of someone who'd had enough visitors lately who weren't bringing good news. She recognized Marin and let them in. Rafael Garza was at the table with coffee that had gone cold, and he had the look of a man calculating something he didn't want the numbers to say. He shook Elias's hand with the particular firmness of someone who wants you to know he's not beaten yet. "They came again," Carmen said before anyone else could speak. She sat down with the baby against her shoulder, patting its back in the automatic way of someone who'd learned the rhythm over weeks of practice. "Yesterday, man named Hollis, same man who came before." "What did he offer?" Marin asked. Raphael named a number. It was a good number. It was, Elias calculated quickly, a number that would let this family start over somewhere with less pressure, somewhere a baby could grow up without the constant threat of being pushed off the land. He hated that it was a good number. He hated it because he knew exactly where that number came from. Not generosity, but strategy. He'd written that strategy. He'd identified the threshold below which a cash-poor young family would say yes. "Don't take it," Marin said. Carmen looked at her. "Marin, if you hold, I hold. If I hold, the whole South Corridor stays broken." She leaned forward slightly. "They need contiguous parcels. Without your land and mine, they can't run a clean corridor. They'll have to route north through the rocky approach. Costs them twice as much, maybe makes the whole venture unprofitable." "And if they route north anyway?" Raphael asked. "If they walk away from us and we've held out for nothing? Then we still have our land." He looked at her. Then at Elias, in the way that men sometimes look at the other man in the room when they're trying to figure out what the other man's angle is. "You work for her?" Raphael asked. "Yes," Elias said. "What do you think we should do?" It was the question Elias had not wanted to be asked, because the honest answer was complicated by the fact that he knew things about Meridian's financing that would change the calculus. Specifically, that Meridian was leveraged. That the investors behind the railway corridor scheme were in a shorter timeline than anyone in this valley knew. That if they couldn't close the corridor acquisition in the next few months, the financing dried up and the whole project collapsed. He'd known those things. He'd structured those things. "I think," he said carefully, "that the company making you this offer has a deadline they haven't told you about. I think they need this land more urgently than their offer price suggests, which means if you hold, you have more leverage than you realize." Raphael looked at him for a long moment. "How do you know that?" "Experience with how these operations work." It wasn't enough of an answer, and everyone at the table knew it. Carmen was looking at him with the sharp, tired eyes of a woman who could smell an incomplete truth from across a room. But Raphael nodded, slowly. "We'll hold," he said. "For now." Riding back, the afternoon light was going gold and thin, the kind of light that makes even struggling land look like something worth fighting for. They rode side by side, which had become a comfortable arrangement over the weeks. Close enough to talk, far enough for dignity. "How do you know about their timeline?" Marin asked. He didn't answer for a moment. "Elias, I've worked with companies like this before. Done what kind of work for them?" The question hung in the cold air between them. He could feel her watching the side of his face. "Not good work," he said. "The kind of work you leave." She was quiet for a moment. The horse's hooves made a soft, rhythmic sound on the packed earth of the road. "Is there something I should know?" she said. "About you? About why you're here?" Yes, he thought, there is almost everything you should know. "Not yet," he said, which was cowardice, and he knew it. She looked at him for a long moment. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Not yet," she repeated. Not angry. Not forgiving either. Just noting it, filing it in that precise internal ledger she kept on everything. All right. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and when they reached the ranch, he took care of both horses without being asked, and she went inside without watching him do it, and the gap between what he was telling her and what was true sat in his chest like a stone he was carrying uphill. The valley was beautiful in the last light. He stood at the barn door and looked at it. The long grass, the dark line of the mountains, the small squares of lamplight coming on in the windows of the main house. He had built the plan to take all of it. He was going to have to figure out how to tell her that before someone else did. The stone didn't get lighter. That was the thing about carrying something like what Elias carried. You adjusted to the weight, learned to move around it, learned to breathe in a way that accommodated it, but it didn't actually get lighter. It just became part of how you walked. November came into the valley like a creditor, inevitable, humorless, demanding what was owed. The first real freeze arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Elias woke at 4:30 to find a thin skin of ice on the water barrel outside the bunkhouse door, and Tommy already in the barn checking on the livestock with a lantern, and the serious expression of someone who understood that cold weather and young animals was a combination that required early attention. They lost a calf that first week. Not to the cold directly, but to a respiratory infection that the cold made worse, and there was nothing to be done about it by the time anyone realized how sick the animal was. Marin stood in the barn stall for a while afterward, not saying anything, with her hand resting on the calf's still flank. Elias and Tommy stayed back. Some things you don't crowd a person through. When she came out, her expression was the same as it always was, controlled, forward-facing. But her jaw was set at an angle that told him something it would have taken another person months to read. She was calculating what the loss meant in dollars, and the dollars were already tight enough that this particular loss had a specific downstream effect she was working through in real time. "We need to check the other 2 calves tonight," she said. "Separate them from the main herd. Keep them in the south stall, where the draft is blocked." "Already started moving them," Tommy said. She looked at him, and for a moment something cracked in her face. Not grief exactly, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding things together for so long that even small victories feel complicated. She put her hand briefly on Tommy's shoulder, just for a second. Then she walked back to the house. Elias looked at Tommy. Tommy looked at him. "She doesn't show it much," Tommy said, "but she counted on those 3 calves." "I know. The ranch is not—" Tommy stopped, started again. "She doesn't tell me everything, but I'm not stupid. I can read a ledger when it's left open on the table." "You shouldn't read her ledger." "I know." He picked up the lantern. "I still do." They worked through the evening in the barn, keeping the remaining calves warm, and Elias thought about the ledger he'd seen briefly. Not Marin's, but the one he carried in his head. The numbers that told him exactly how close the Callaway Ranch was to the edge. He'd known those numbers before he ever arrived here, because the acquisition model he'd built had required knowing them. The vulnerability analysis. That was the term they used in the Denver offices. Vulnerability analysis. Identifying which ranches were most susceptible to pressure based on their financial position, their water access, their isolation from legal resources. The Callaway Ranch had ranked 3rd on that list. Not the most vulnerable, but close enough to be a priority target. He'd written that assessment. In his actual handwriting, in an office with good windows and a view of the mountains that he'd taken for granted, before he understood what the numbers on paper turned into when they became decisions that landed on actual people. He forked more hay into the stall and tried not to think about it, which he was getting progressively worse at as the weeks went on. The lawyers came the following week. 2 of them, in a buggy that was too nice for the road they'd taken to get here, wearing coats that cost more than most people in Ash Hollow spent on clothing in a year. They pulled up to the main house mid-morning while Elias was repairing the south pasture gate and Tommy was splitting firewood near the barn. Marin came out onto the porch before they'd finished tying off their horse. She stood at the top of the steps with her arms crossed and watched them come across the yard with the look of someone who had decided the outcome of this conversation before it started. The older of the 2 lawyers, a thin man named Garrett, with a leather satchel and a practiced, sympathetic expression, introduced himself and his associate and told her they represented Meridian Land Holdings and were here to discuss a potential purchase agreement regarding the Callaway Ranch and associated water rights. "I know who you represent," Marin said, "and I know what you want." "Mrs. Callaway." "Miss Callaway, my father built this ranch. I've run it for 6 years. I know every acre of it, and I know what it's worth, and I know that what Meridian is offering is about half of that, which means they either think I'm stupid or they think I'm desperate." Garrett smiled the smile of a man who'd had this conversation many times and knew how to be patient with it. "Our offer reflects current market valuations for—" "Your offer reflects what you calculated I'd accept under duress," Marin said, "which tells me a great deal about what you think of me and not much about what the land is actually worth." She was good at this, Elias thought. He'd stopped working on the gate and was watching because there wasn't much pretense that he was doing anything else. Tommy had stopped splitting wood too. Garrett shifted his satchel. "The current acquisition landscape in this valley suggests that independent holdings become increasingly difficult to sustain. Are you telling me my neighbors sold so I should sell too?" "I'm suggesting that the practical realities—" "Mr. Garrett." Her voice dropped half a degree in temperature, which was more effective than raising it would have been. I have work to do. If you have a new offer that reflects the actual value of this property, including the water rights that your clients have been illegally diverting for 6 weeks, put it in writing and send it to the land office. Otherwise, I'd appreciate you getting back in your buggy. Garrett looked at her for a moment. Then his gaze moved across the yard, and it found Elias by the gate, a look that lasted about 2 seconds before moving on. And Elias turned back to the gate latch with a feeling like cold water moving through his chest. The lawyers left. Marin came down off the porch and walked across the yard toward the gate where Elias was working. She didn't say anything about the confrontation. She looked at the gate latch. "Is it the hinge or the post?" she asked. "Post," he said. "Hinge is fine. The post has been leaning for a while and it's finally pulled the latch out of alignment. Can you fix it today?" "This afternoon." She nodded. She didn't move to go, though. She stood there with her hands in her vest pockets looking at the gatepost, and he could feel her thinking. "They'll be back," she said. "Yes. They'll try something different next time. The water diversion didn't work, the lawyer visits aren't working. They'll find another angle." Elias looked at her sidelong. "You're right." "What would you do?" she asked. "If you were them, what's the next move?" It was a dangerous question to answer because he knew the answer precisely, and giving it would mean giving away how he knew it, but the alternative was leaving her underprepared for what was coming. "They'll attack the social fabric," he said. "Start rumors about the ranch's financial situation. Tell the neighbors that you're close to foreclosure. Make it seem like holding out is pointless because you won't last anyway. Make it harder for you to hire workers by suggesting the wages are unreliable. Maybe approach your creditors if you have any outstanding loans and try to accelerate the payment terms." She was very still. "And," he said, "they'll probably make the Garzas a second offer that's bigger than the first. Separate you from your allies before they push harder on you directly." Silence. A horse in the south pasture blew out a long breath that hung in the cold air. "You've seen this playbook before," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "From which side?" The question was quiet and entirely precise and landed exactly where she aimed it. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the post that needed setting and thought about what kind of man would have the answer to that question and be standing here fixing a gate on a ranch in Wyoming instead of being where a man like that normally was. "I need to tell you something," he said, "but I need you to hear the whole of it before you—" "Elias," her voice was careful. "Whatever it is, don't tell me right now. I need you functional, and I need to think. And if what you're about to tell me is what I'm starting to suspect it might be, I would prefer to have it in a moment when I'm not already managing 6 other things." He looked at her. She was looking at the gatepost, jaw set, and the muscle in her cheek was tight. "All right," he said. "Fix the post," she said, "and then I need you to ride to the Pruitt place and warn Martha about the next steps. Tell her what you just told me. If they're going to try to isolate us, we move first and close ranks." She walked back toward the house. He watched her go and he thought, she already knows. Not the specifics, not the name or the history, but the shape of the thing. She'd known for a while that the edges of what he was telling her didn't quite match the shape of a man who'd done freighting in Nebraska. She just wasn't ready yet, and neither was he, and so they were both living in the temporary shelter of not quite knowing and hoping the weather held. It didn't hold for long. Martha Pruitt was 71 years old and had been on her land since before half the current residents of the valley were born. She was small and spare with white hair pinned back severely and eyes the color of winter sky, pale and cold and seeing everything. She kept the shotgun by the door that everyone had heard about, and when Elias arrived, she answered his knock with it in the crook of her arm, held in the comfortable way of someone who'd been carrying it for 50 years and didn't think of it as dramatic. "You're the new man at the Cowboy place," she said. Not a greeting exactly, more of a classification. "Yes, ma'am. Elias Mercer. Marin sent me." Martha looked him over with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen enough people to have calibrated opinions about them quickly. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in then, kettle's on." Her kitchen was small and completely organized, everything in its place with the precision of a woman who lived alone and had decided long ago that chaos was not something she was willing to tolerate. There were photographs on the mantelpiece. A man who must have been her husband, younger versions of people who might have been children, a single faded image of the valley that showed it with fewer buildings and more open grass. She poured tea without asking if he wanted it and sat down across from him. He told her what he'd told Marin about the next expected moves from Meridian. She listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of courtesy. When he finished, she wrapped both hands around her cup and was quiet for a moment. "They sent a man named Hollis 3 weeks ago," she said. "Told me my property wasn't worth half what I think it is, and that if I didn't sell before winter, I'd find it worth even less come spring." She paused. "I told him I'd been managing this land through 2 droughts, a flood, a cattle disease outbreak in '71, and the death of my husband, and I didn't think a man in a nice coat was going to be the thing that finally broke me." "What did he say to that?" "He wrote something in his little book and left." She looked at Elias over her tea. "They'll come back." "Yes." "With a bigger number." "Probably, but also with more pressure, not just on you, on the people around you. They'll try to make you feel like you're alone in this." Martha set down her cup. "Are we? Alone?" "Not if you and the Garzas and the Calloways hold together." "That's 3 ranches," she said, "against a company with lawyers and money, and apparently no shortage of either." "Yes." "And you think we can hold?" "I think you can create enough friction that they miss their window. If their financing has a deadline, and I believe it does, then delay is a form of winning." She studied him for a long moment. "You believe it does?" she repeated. "How sure are you of that?" "Sure enough," he said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Young man, I've been on this earth long enough to know what sure enough sounds like when someone's working around something they don't want to say outright." She tilted her head. "Are you going to tell me what it is you're not saying, or should I just assume the worst and work from there?" He looked at her across the small kitchen table with the thin winter light coming through the window behind her, and he thought, this woman would handle the truth better than most. She had the kind of steadiness that comes from having already survived the worst imaginable things and discovered you're still standing. "I'm going to handle it," he said, "before it becomes something you need to know." "That's not reassuring." "I know. I'm sorry." Martha Pruitt looked at him for another beat, then picked up her tea. "Marin's father was a good man," she said. "He didn't always make the right decisions, but he always made them for the right reasons. I've been watching that girl run that ranch since he died, and she is harder and better than he was, and that is saying something." She paused. "Don't make a fool of her trust." The words were quiet and direct, and they hit him somewhere below the breastbone with a precision that surprised him. "No, ma'am," he said. He rode back to the Calloway Ranch in the dark, the cold working its way through his jacket in a way that had become familiar, and he thought about what it would take to handle it, actually handle it, not just manage the symptoms. He had resources he hadn't touched. He had contacts he hadn't used. He had, somewhere in a bank in Denver under his real name, enough money to make decisions that a ranch hand named Elias Mercer had no business making. He'd walked away from all of it. Not clean. There was no clean way to walk away from something like what he'd built. But he'd stepped back from the operational control, transferred his decision-making role to the board, told himself that the distance made him less responsible for what the company continued to do. Sitting in the dark on the road to the Calloway Ranch with Martha Pruitt's words still in his chest, he recognized that reasoning for exactly what it was. Marin had kept a lamp on in the main house. He could see it from the road, a small square of yellow light in the black of the valley. He stopped his horse for a moment and looked at it. Then he rode in, unsaddled the horse, and went to his bunk. December came. The work didn't slow. If anything, winter made it harder because everything that needed doing had to be done in shorter days with colder hands and the additional burden of keeping both people and animals warm against temperatures that dropped into the teens at night. Elias split cord after cord of wood, repaired a section of the barn roof where snow load was causing a sag that could become a collapse, and spent 3 days running new pipe from the repaired water trough to a second access point in the east pasture so the herd didn't have to be walked as far in the cold. He worked until his body had nothing left in it at the end of each day, which was the point. The work was honest in a way that most of his life up until a year ago had not been, and that honesty was something he was learning to need in the way you need something you didn't know you were missing. And then there were the evenings. The evenings had evolved without anyone exactly deciding they would. It had started practically. Marin reviewing property documents at the kitchen table, Elias present initially to answer questions about what he'd found in the county records, and then just present because he was there, and the work was there, and the lamp was warm. Tommy usually disappeared to the bunkhouse after supper, claiming he had things to do, which Elias suspected was an act of deliberate tact that the boy would never admit to. They talked about the ranch, about the valley, about the pressure from Meridian and the strategies for resistance and the practical problems of livestock and weather and infrastructure. But they also talked about other things, gradually, in the halting way of two people who have gotten used to being guarded and are encountering, with some surprise, the inclination to be less so. She told him about her father on one of those evenings. Not directly, not as a story she was sitting down to tell, but in fragments that came out as they talked about the ranch's history. How he'd come out here from Ohio 20 years ago with almost nothing. How he'd worked other people's land for 3 years before he had enough to buy his own. How he'd built the main house with 2 other men over the course of a summer, and how one of those men had become his closest friend and eventually betrayed him in a business deal that cost him 200 acres. He never talked about it, she said. She was mending a bridle, her hands moving with the automatic competence of long practice. The betrayal. He talked around it sometimes, but he'd taught me early that the land matters more than the people who try to take it, and I think that was his way of processing what happened. Do you believe that? Elias asked. That the land matters more? She looked up from the bridle. No, I don't think I do, actually. I think I believed it for a long time because he believed it. But the land is just land. It's the... She stopped, seemed to weigh what she was about to say. It's the life built on it that matters, the history, the work. Yes, he said. She looked at him. Why did you leave? Whatever you left, you never actually said. Because I finally understood what I was building, he said, and who it was costing. She was quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove crackled and settled. That takes something, she said carefully, to see that about yourself. It took longer than it should have. She went back to the bridle. He watched the fire through the gap in the stove door. My father trusted the wrong man, she said, and lost 200 acres and 6 years of work. He never quite recovered from it. Not financially. He managed that eventually, but something in how he trusted people changed after that. She pulled a stitch tight. I didn't want to end up that way. Closed off. So I decided to be more careful rather than more closed. Is there a difference? I think so. Careful means you watch how people act over time. Closed means you've already decided it doesn't matter. She was watching him say this, and he knew she was saying it about him specifically, that she was telling him that she was watching, that she was being careful, that she had not decided yet. That's fair, he said. It's practical, she corrected. But there was something in her voice that was not entirely practical, and they both knew it, and they both chose not to name it, because naming it would require either courage or recklessness, and neither of them had agreed to which. Outside, the wind was running hard off the mountains, pushing against the house in long, sustained pushes that made the walls speak. The lamp between them burned steady because the house was well built. Her father's work, solid in the foundations where it counted, and the sound of the storm outside made the inside feel more specifically warm. You should sleep, she said eventually. 5 o'clock. You should sleep too, he said. She looked at him with one eyebrow slightly raised, which was as close as she got to amusement in moments like this. Good night, Elias. He pulled on his coat and went out into the wind. The bad news came on a Thursday in the 3rd week of December, carried by Rafael Garza, who rode into the Callaway yard in the early afternoon with a look on his face like a man delivering something he wished he didn't have. Meridian had made their second offer to the Garzas. It was significantly higher than the first, and it came with something the first offer hadn't included, a document showing that the bank holding the Garza mortgage had transferred the loan to a new creditor, and that the new creditor was requesting full repayment within 90 days. Marin read the document at the kitchen table. Elias read it over her shoulder. Raphael stood near the door with his hat in his hands. They bought your debt, Marin said, from First Territorial Bank. I didn't even know they could do that, sell the mortgage to someone else without telling us. They can, Elias said. It's legal, standard practice in certain types of acquisition campaigns. He felt Marin's gaze flick to him and held his neutral expression. If you can't pay within 90 days, they foreclose. But they'll probably offer you the sale price as an alternative, walk away solvent instead of losing the property through foreclosure. Which means they own us either way, Raphael said. Yes. The silence in the kitchen was the particular silence of people confronting a wall that just got taller. How much is the balance on the mortgage? Marin asked. Raphael told her. It was not a number she could cover. It was not a number any of them could cover. That was the point. The 90 days, Elias said. That buys you some time. Don't make any decision until you've exhausted every option. We've been through our options, Raphael said quietly. Carmen is... He stopped. She's tired. The baby's been sick. She's been managing all of it while I try to keep the cattle fed and the fences up, and I don't have much left to fight with. The admission cost him something. You could see it in the way he said it. The particular difficulty of a man acknowledging exhaustion to people he respected. Marin stood up. She went to the cabinet where she kept the ranch records and pulled out her own financial ledger and stood at the counter looking at numbers that Elias knew were not generous. He watched her face as she worked through it. The set jaw, the slight tightening around her eyes. She was looking for room that probably wasn't there. I can cover 6 months of your interest payments, she said finally. It won't touch the principal, but it might buy enough time to find another solution. Raphael looked at her. Marin, your own ranch is... My ranch is my business, she said, not harshly, but firmly. Do you want the help or not? He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet where a man is deciding whether his pride costs more than his family. Then, yes, thank you. After he left, Marin stood at the counter for a long moment. Elias was still at the table. That was about 40% of your cash reserve, he said. I know what it was. If anything else goes wrong this winter, I know? She turned around. Her face was tired in a way she didn't usually let it be in front of him. I know exactly where that leaves me. I did the math while you were watching me do it. She pushed off the counter. But if the Garzas fold, Martha Pruitt folds next. And if Martha folds, I'm completely isolated, and it's over anyway. She looked at him steadily. So it was either spend the money or lose everything trying to save it. Sometimes the only way forward is through. He looked at her across the kitchen. The winter light was flat and cold through the window. She looked like what she was. A woman running out of runway, making the best decisions available from a shrinking list of options, doing it without flinching. You should know, he said carefully, that what they did with the Garza mortgage, buying the debt to force a decision, that's not improvised. That's a specific tactic from a specific playbook. They're accelerating. I know, which means their timeline is shorter than we thought. If they're spending money to accelerate, they're feeling pressure from somewhere. From their investors, she said. He looked at her sharply. I'm not stupid, she said. I've been doing my own research. Meridian is backed by a consortium of Eastern investors who were promised a railway corridor deal. If the deal doesn't close, the investors pull out, which means Meridian needs the corridor completed before... She stopped. Before when, Elias? What's the deadline? He'd been dreading this question for weeks, because the answer was specific. The answer was a date he knew because he'd sat in the room when the investment agreement was structured. Spring, he said. End of April, maybe 1st of May. After that, the primary investors have an exit clause. The silence was long and complete. How do you know that? She asked. Her voice was not loud. It was very precise. How do you know the specific terms of Meridian's investment agreement? Because that's not public record. That's internal documentation. He looked at her. She looked at him. And in her eyes he could see it. The final piece sliding into place, the shape of the thing she'd been circling for weeks, finally resolving into a form she could name. He watched it happen. He watched understanding arrive, and then watched what came after understanding, which was something that looked like a door closing. Elias, she said, who are you? The fire in the stove crackled. Outside, the wind pushed hard against the south wall of the house. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted and the barn boards took the weight of it. My name, he said slowly, is not Elias Mercer. She didn't move, didn't look away. My name is Callum Ashford, he said, and about 2 years ago, I was one of the principal architects of Meridian Land Holdings. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She didn't cry. That was almost worse. Marin stood in her kitchen with both hands flat on the counter behind her, like she needed the wood to hold her upright, and she looked at him with an expression that was beyond anger, past it, through it, into something quieter and more final. Her face had gone the color of old ash, and the muscle in her jaw was working, and her eyes were doing what they did when she was calculating something, except this time what she was calculating was not numbers. She was calculating how badly she'd been wrong. Callum Ashford, she said. The name sounded strange in the room, foreign, like a word in a language that didn't belong here. Yes. You built Meridian. The original framework, the acquisition model, the railway corridor strategy. He made himself say it plainly without softening it. The vulnerability analysis that identified which ranches to target first and how. The last sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. The vulnerability analysis, she repeated, slowly. A document that ranked holdings in this valley by financial fragility, water access, legal resources, how susceptible each ranch would be to sustained pressure. He held her gaze. The Calloway Ranch was third on that list. She was quiet for a moment that stretched out long enough that he could hear his own heartbeat. You came here knowing that, she said. You rode into my yard knowing you'd ranked my home on a list of targets. Yes. You asked me for work knowing what you'd built was already being used against me. Yes. She pushed off the counter. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard, and he could see her reflection in the glass, a face he'd spent 2 months learning to read, now completely unreadable. Why? She said, not asking him to justify it, asking for the architecture of it, the way she asked about everything she needed to understand. I left Meridian about a year ago, he said. I'd watched what the operation had become, what I'd built it into, and I couldn't keep pretending the distance made me less responsible. I walked out, I gave up my stake, transferred my interest, left Denver. He paused. I was riding west without a specific plan. When I came through this valley, I knew it, recognized it from the maps and assessments I'd worked with. I knew what was being done here. And you stopped. Yes. Because of conscience, she said. The word was perfectly flat. Because I couldn't keep going and pretend I hadn't seen it. She turned from the window. Her face was still that controlled ashen thing. You could have gone to the county seat, talked to the land commissioner, sent an anonymous letter to someone with authority. There were a dozen ways to help this valley that didn't require lying to my face for 2 months. Yes, he said. There were. So why this? Why come here? Invent a name, ask for work, sit at my table. Her voice broke slightly, not with grief, but with something closer to contempt that was working to hold itself in check. Why spend 2 months letting me believe I could trust you? Because I needed to understand what I'd actually done, he said. Not in the abstract, not on paper. I needed to stand in it. The silence that followed was not the thoughtful kind. It was the kind that forms when something has broken and both people in the room can hear the pieces on the floor. Get out of my house, she said. He didn't move immediately. Marin, tonight, I need you to leave tonight. The Garzas, I'll handle the Garzas. Her voice was ice over a current. I'll handle Martha Pruitt and the lawyers and the water rights and every single thing I was handling before you arrived in my yard with your stolen name and your borrowed conscience. Get out. He got up from the table. He pulled on his coat. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door where it had lived for 2 months. I'm going to fix it, he said at the door. What I built. What it's doing here. She was looking at the window again, not at him. Don't make me promises, she said. I'm done with men who make promises in my kitchen. He went out into the cold. The night was clear and brutal, stars hard and white above the black line of the mountains. He stood in the yard for a moment, the cold working through his coat immediately, the sound of the wind in the dry grass at the edge of the property carrying that particular loneliness that open land has at night when you're standing in it alone. He thought he was ready for it. He hadn't been ready for it. He went to the bunkhouse and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and didn't light the lamp. He sat there for a long time. Then he started packing. He packed exactly what he'd arrived with, the canvas bag, the same clothing, the revolver. He left the extra shirts Marin had given him from a trunk of her father's things. He left the good pair of work gloves she'd handed him without comment when his wore through in November. He set them on the bunk in a neat pile and looked at them for a moment, and then picked up his bag and walked out, He did not take the horse that had been assigned to him. It was a Callaway horse, which made it not his. He walked. It was 4 miles to Ash Hollow, which in that temperature was 4 miles of the kind of cold that works its way into your thinking and makes everything feel very simple and very final. He walked at a steady pace and did not look back, because looking back would have been self-indulgent in a way that the situation didn't merit. He arrived in Ash Hollow at something past midnight. The dusty spur was still burning a light, but he didn't go in. He found the livery, woke the man sleeping in the front stall with an apology and $3, bought a horse that was old but sound, and rode out of town headed south toward the telegraph office in Tanner Creek, 20 miles away. He had exactly one move that mattered, and he needed to make it before he made anything else. He arrived in Tanner Creek before dawn and waited on the steps of the telegraph office until the operator arrived at 7 in the morning, a young man with round glasses who looked at Elias, who looked like someone who'd been walking in the cold for a significant portion of the night, with the careful neutrality of someone in a service profession. Elias sent 3 telegrams. The first went to a lawyer in Denver named Hardcastle, who'd handled the original incorporation of Meridian and who owed Elias a professional debt that had never been called in. The second went to the bank where Callum Ashford's assets still sat, untouched, because he'd been living as someone else and hadn't needed them. The third went to a man named Voss in Chicago, who had been the primary investor in the Meridian Railway Corridor project, and who had not, to Elias's knowledge, fully understood what the ground-level acquisition campaign actually looked like when it met actual people. He sent that third telegram because he'd known Voss for 15 years, and he'd watched Voss, when confronted with genuine information about the human cost of his investments, make different decisions. Not always, but sometimes. And sometimes was enough to try. Then he rented a room at the single boarding house in Tanner Creek and slept for 5 hours. He woke to a knock on the door. It was the telegraph operator holding a reply from Hardcastle. It was terse and professional, which was Hardcastle's mode, and it said, "Received. Consequences significant. Confirm intention and call your bank." He went and called his bank. This was, for the record, the first time in 2 months that Callum Ashford had conducted any business as himself. He spoke to the bank manager with the practiced brevity of a man who'd run significant financial operations and knew how to communicate in that register, and listening to himself do it was a strange experience, like putting on clothes from a previous life and finding they still fit in the shoulders, but felt wrong everywhere else. He authorized a transfer, then another. Then he asked about the Garza mortgage that had been transferred to a Meridian-aligned creditor and was told the process for repurchasing it, and he initiated that process. He came out of the bank into the cold Tanner Creek morning and stood on the boardwalk and looked at the mountains to the north and thought, this is going to take more than money. Money was the easiest part, actually. Money he had. What he didn't have was standing. Not in this valley, not anymore. What he didn't have was Marin Calloway's trust, or the rancher's trust, or the right to walk back into the community he'd spent 2 months becoming part of and say, "I'm fixing it," without being laughed out of the territory. What came next was not going to be clean. It was not going to be clean, and it was not going to be quick, and he was going to have to do it anyway. He rode back toward Ash Hollow. He was 2 miles out from town when he saw the riders coming toward him, 3 of them, on good horses, and the man in the front was someone he recognized with a drop in his stomach that was not quite surprise. Victor Hollis, Meridian's chief operations manager, the man who ran the ground campaign, the lawyers, the pressure tactics, the debt acquisitions. He was somewhere in his late 40s, with the compact, organized manner of a man who'd spent his career making difficult things happen efficiently. He'd worked for Callum Ashford for 4 years. He had a long, excellent memory. Hollis pulled up when he saw Elias on the road. They were 20 yards apart. His 2 men stopped behind him. Hollis looked at him for a moment with an expression that was carefully empty. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "I heard a rumor you were in the territory." Hollis, working a ranch, from what I understand. He looked at Elias's clothes, his horse, the canvas bag tied to the saddle. "You look like a man who just got fired. How long have you known I was here?" "About 3 weeks. I sent word to the board." He paused. "They were displeased." "I imagine they were." Hollis shifted in his saddle, and there was something in the ease of it that was a deliberate display of comfort, of occupying more space than necessary. He'd always done that. Elias had watched it across a lot of conference tables without quite registering it as a tell until now, when it felt like a threat without being one you could name. "You sent some telegrams this morning," Hollis said. Elias felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You're monitoring the Tanner Creek say something that doesn't require apology. The telegram to Voss is a problem. Whatever you think you're doing, I'm dissolving the corridor acquisition," Elias said. "I retained a reversionary interest in the original land claims when I transferred my stake. Hardcastle will confirm the legal basis. The claims revert to me, and I'm releasing them back to the families." The silence between them was the kind that happens when someone says something and the other person is calculating how true it is. "You retained the reversionary interest," Hollis said slowly. "I did. That's—" He stopped. Elias could see him doing the legal geometry in his head, working through the incorporation documents, the transfer agreement, the specific language that Elias had quietly, carefully, and with considerable foresight preserved when everyone else was focused on the numbers. That would require board approval to override. "Yes, and I've already contacted Voss. When he understands what's actually been happening here, the water diversions, the debt purchases, the pressure on families with new babies," he paused. "He'll pull out, I know him. And without his financing, you don't have a board decision. You have a collapse." Hollis stared at him. The two men behind him were still and quiet. "You're going to destroy everything we built," Hollis said. "I'm going to return a dozen properties to the people they were taken from. The railway corridor was viable without this method. It could have been done through honest purchase at fair prices." He held Hollis's gaze. "You know that. Fair prices don't produce the same returns." "No," Elias said. "They don't." The look that passed between them in that moment contained 4 years of professional history. The meetings, the decisions, the moments where either of them could have said, "This is the wrong way to do this," and neither of them had. Elias felt the weight of his portion of that without trying to shift it. Hollis sat very still on his horse. Then he said quietly, "If you do this, we'll come after the reversionary interest in court. We'll tie it up for years." "Try," Elias said. "Hardcastle will enjoy it." He rode past them on the narrow road. He kept his back straight and his pace steady, and he was acutely aware of the 3 riders behind him and the specific math of a man with a revolver on a horse, and 3 men who had every operational reason to make a problem disappear. Nothing happened. He rode into Ash Hollow in the early afternoon and tied his horse at the livery and walked into Harlan Webb's store, and Harlan looked at him the way he'd looked at him the first time, assessing, recalibrating. Except this time, what he was working with was different information. "Heard there was some kind of trouble at the Calloway place," Harlan said. "Marin came in this morning. She didn't say much, but she looked like a woman who'd had a bad night." "She had a bad night," Elias said. "I caused it." Harlan looked at him over the counter. "You leaving?" "No." "Even though she asked you to?" "Even though?" Harlan was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" Elias set money on the counter for a box of ammunition he didn't particularly need but bought to give the conversation a transactional frame. "I'm going to fix what I broke, starting with what I can fix today." "And Marin?" "That's not mine to fix," he said. "That's hers to decide." He went back out. The thing about Ash Hollow that he'd understood since the first week was that it was a small enough place that news moved faster than horses. By the time he walked down the main street to the land commissioner's small office, 2 rooms in the back of a building that also housed a saddle maker, word had already started moving. He could feel it in the way people looked at him, the conversations that paused, the specific quality of attention that a frontier town gives to the stranger who has suddenly become a story. The land commissioner was a man named Dewhurst, 60s, cautious, the kind of official who'd survived multiple changes of political administration by being extremely careful about which way the wind was blowing before he committed to anything. Elias sat across from him and explained who he was. Not Elias Mercer, Callum Ashford. He put documentation on the desk, a letter from Hardcastle, his real identification papers, and the reversionary interest clause from the original Meridian Incorporation document. Dewhurst read everything twice. He was quiet for a long time. "If this reversionary interest holds," he said, and you intend to release the claims back to the original owners. All of them, Elias said. Henderson, Alderman, Burton, every parcel acquired through Meridian's campaign in this valley. The Burtons left the territory. Alderman is in Cheyenne. I'll find them, or their heirs. I have a lawyer who can handle the documentation. Dewhurst looked at him over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who'd seen land schemes come and go for 30 years and was working out which category this fell into. And what do you get out of this? Nothing, Elias said. That's rather the point. Dewhurst leaned back in his chair and made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh that decided not to finish. He looked at the documents again. I'll need to verify the legal standing with the territorial court. Could take 2 weeks. Fine. In the meantime, I need a formal complaint filed against the water diversion on the Henderson parcel. Prior appropriation violation, 4 documented witnesses. He set another paper on the desk. I prepared the complaint. You just need to file it. Dewhurst looked at the prepared complaint, then at Elias. You're organized for a ranch hand. I used to be a different kind of man, Elias said. He was back on the street by 3 o'clock. The wind had picked up again, blowing dust and dead leaves along the empty main road, and he stood in it for a moment, orienting himself to what came next. What came next was the part he had no official process for, no document to prepare, no legal mechanism to deploy. What came next was the people. He went to the Garza place first. Carmen answered the door with the baby on her shoulder and looked at him with eyes that had clearly been informed by Raphael, who was in the yard behind him, that things were not exactly as they had appeared. I know who you are, she said. I know you do. You built the thing that's trying to take our land. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. The baby made a small sound and she shifted it automatically, the practiced adjustment of someone for whom the baby's needs had become a physical reflex. What do you want? To tell you that your mortgage has been repurchased. The debt is now held by an account in my name, and I'm releasing it. You don't owe a payment. The loan is cleared. Carmen stared at him. That's not... She stopped. That's thousands of dollars. Yes. Why? Because I put you in that position, he said. Not directly, but I built the system that did. That's close enough to direct for me. Behind her, Raphael had come to stand in the doorway. He was looking at Elias with the expression of a man who wanted very badly to be angry and was finding it difficult because someone had just removed a weight he'd been carrying for months. The documentation will come from Hardcastle's office in Denver, Elias said. Should take a week. In the meantime, I'm putting the notice of release in writing today. He handed Raphael a folded paper. Keep that. He went to Martha Pruitt's next. She answered the door without the shotgun this time, which suggested she'd already heard something. She stood in the doorway and looked at him with those winter sky eyes and said, Come in, I'll make tea. He sat at her kitchen table again and told her who he was and what he'd built and what he was doing about it. She listened without interrupting, as she always did. She asked 3 specific questions about the legal mechanism of the reversionary interest, which he answered as clearly as he could. Then she sat with her tea for a moment. You should have told her first, Martha said, before any of this, before anyone else. I know. Marin, I mean. Before you rode to Tanner Creek and sent telegrams, before you came here, you should have gone back to her and told her what you were doing. She asked me to leave. She asked you to leave because you lied to her. She didn't ask you to disappear. Martha set down her cup with the deliberate precision of someone making a point through an object. There's a difference. If you can't see the difference, you haven't actually understood what you did wrong. He sat with that. The legal things can be handled by lawyers, she said. That's what lawyers are for. What can't be handled by lawyers is the part that matters most. She looked at him steadily. You know that. I know that, he said. It was getting toward evening when he rode back toward the Callaway Ranch. He hadn't decided to go back, or he hadn't made a conscious decision, but his horse seemed to know the road, and he wasn't inclined to argue with the horse. He stopped at the gate. The main house had its lamps lit, the same warm squares of light against the dark. He could see a figure moving behind the kitchen window. Tommy was probably in the bunkhouse. The barn was quiet. He got off his horse and stood at the gate and didn't go through it. Marin came out onto the porch. He wasn't sure if she'd heard his horse or if it was coincidence, But she came out and stood in the lamplight spilling through the open door behind her and looked at him at the gate. They were maybe 50 feet apart, close enough to hear each other clearly, far enough that neither of them was making any assumptions. "I filed a complaint with Dewhurst about the water diversion," he said. "It should force them to restore the creek flow within the month." She didn't say anything. "I initiated the process to reverse the land claims. Hardcastle is handling it. The Burtons and Aldermen will be contacted. They can come back if they want their land or receive compensation. The Henderson parcel will be released." He paused. "The Garza mortgage is cleared. I put it in writing today." She was very still on the porch. "Hollis tried to stop me on the road," he said. "He won't be able to. The reversionary interest holds and Voss is pulling the investment. Without the financing, Meridian's corridor project is finished." Silence. The wind came through the dry grass at the edge of the property, the same wind he'd been hearing for 2 months from the bunkhouse window. "Why are you telling me this here?" she said. "At the gate." "Because you asked me to leave and I'm trying to respect that." "But you came back." "Yes. Why?" He thought about what Martha had said about the difference between leaving and disappearing. He thought about the lamp in the window on the night he'd ridden back from Tanner Creek and what it had meant that she'd left it burning. "Because Martha Pruitt told me I should have come to you first," he said. "And she was right. And because—" He stopped, took a breath of cold air. "Because I don't know how to undo what I lied about. I don't know if that's undoable, but I'm going to do the rest of it right, and you should know what the rest of it is." She stood on the porch for a long time. Then she said, "The horse needs water." He didn't understand immediately. "Your horse," she said. "It needs water. There's a trough on the north side of the barn." He stood there holding the reins. "You can water your horse," she said, "and then you can go sleep in the bunkhouse. Tommy left your gloves on the bed." She went back inside and the door closed. He stood at the gate in the dark for a moment. Then he walked his horse through the gate and around to the north side of the barn and let it drink. And he stood there listening to the sound of the horse drinking and the wind in the grass and the distant sound of coyotes somewhere out past the south pasture. She hadn't forgiven him. That was not what had just happened. She hadn't even said she would. She'd let a horse drink water and acknowledged the existence of a bunkhouse. These were small things that did not add up to anything he deserved or anything he should take as more than what they were. But he stood there in the cold anyway, with something in his chest that felt, cautiously, and without any right to it, like the possibility that what comes after the truth might be different from what comes before it. The gloves were on the bed where she'd said they'd be. He didn't know what to do with that, so he set them on the small table beside the bunk, lay down in his clothes against the cold, and stared at the ceiling of the bunkhouse while the wind pushed against the walls, and let himself think about what tomorrow was going to ask of him. It was going to ask a great deal. He was, for once in his life, prepared to give it. Morning came the way it always did on the frontier, indifferent to what had happened the night before, demanding the same things it demanded every other day. The animals needed feeding, the water needed hauling. The cold sat at roughly 8 degrees and had opinions about exposed skin. Elias was at the barn at 5 o'clock. He didn't knock on the main house door or announce himself or make any statement about his presence. He simply started doing the work that needed doing, because the work needed doing regardless of where things stood between him and the woman in the house, and because he'd learned over 2 months that the best thing he could offer in any situation was to be useful. Tommy found him in the barn 20 minutes later, carrying the lantern with his serious early morning expression. The boy looked at him for a long moment. He clearly knew something had happened. There was a particular quality to Tommy's silence that indicated awareness rather than obliviousness. But he didn't ask. He picked up the feed bucket and started on the horses, and they worked side by side in the cold barn in the way they'd been working for weeks. And that was its own kind of answer. Marin came out at 5:30. She was dressed for work, which meant she intended to pretend, or perhaps not pretend, but decide that the morning was like other mornings, at least in its practical requirements. She looked at Elias briefly when she entered the barn. He looked back. No words were exchanged that weren't about the horses, and they didn't need to be. The days that followed were not comfortable. That was the honest word for them. Not terrible, but not easy, like walking on ground that had frozen unevenly and could turn an ankle if you weren't careful. They worked alongside each other because the ranch required it, and because neither of them was the kind of person who used weather or animals or manual necessity as a casualty of their personal difficulties. But the evenings were different. The kitchen table that had become their space of quiet conversation was now just a table, and Marin took her ledger to the other room more often than not, and Elias sat in the bunkhouse with the lamp and his thoughts and gave her the distance she hadn't asked for in words, but had communicated with a clarity that required no translation. The town knew. That was perhaps inevitable. Ash Hollow was small enough that a secret wasn't really a secret so much as a thing that hadn't been said out loud yet, and the combination of Elias's trip to Tanner Creek, his conversations with Dewhurst, and Victor Hollis's departure from the territory in the third week of December had generated enough activity that people were asking questions. Harlan Webb knew because Harlan always knew things, and once Harlan knew something, the information moved through the town with the reliability of creek water finding the lowest ground. By Christmas, most of Ash Hollow understood that the quiet ranch hand at the Calloway place was the man who'd built Meridian, and that he was now dismantling it. The reactions were not uniform. Martha Pruitt, to nobody's great surprise, had been straightforward. Raphael and Carmen Garza, whose mortgage had been formally cleared in the second week of December with documentation from Hardcastle's office, were operating in the complicated emotional territory of people who'd been wronged, then helped, by the same person, which doesn't resolve neatly into either gratitude or resentment, but sits somewhere in between. The Hendersons had been contacted in Cheyenne and had sent a letter back that was brief and careful, saying they were considering their options regarding the property. The harder reactions came from the ranchers who'd had less direct involvement but had watched their valley shrink. A man named Cord Whitmore, who ran cattle on the north side and had lost a water deal to Meridian's acquisitions, came into town one afternoon and saw Elias at the general store and said things that were specific and loud enough that the three other people in the store heard every word. Elias took it. He didn't argue, didn't explain himself, didn't point to what he was doing to fix it. He waited for Whitmore to finish, said that he understood, and left. That was all. Harlan, who had witnessed the exchange, said nothing until Whitmore left, and then said to Elias, "You didn't defend yourself." "He wasn't wrong," Elias said. "He was pretty rough about it." "That's his right. He picked up the supplies he'd come for. Rough doesn't make it untrue." Harlan looked at him for a moment in the measuring way he had. "You going to keep coming into town after something like that?" "I have things to do in town," Elias said. "I'm not going to stop doing them because it's uncomfortable." He came back the next week and the week after that, and Cord Whitmore said nothing the second time and nodded slightly, barely perceptibly. The third, and that was how some things went. Not quickly, not cleanly, but in the direction of something that might eventually be called a reckoning, met and lived through. The water diversion was formally resolved in the second week of January, when Dewhurst's complaint forced the issue and the Meridian field crew, largely abandoned after Hollis's departure and operating on diminishing authority, dismantled the creek dam. Elias rode up to the site on the day it came down and watched the water find its original channel again, running clear and cold and with the particular purposefulness that water has when it's going where it's supposed to go. He stood there for a while. Then he rode back. The creek fed back into the Calloway supply within 2 days, and the water level in the trough climbed back to where it needed to be, and Marin checked it one morning without saying anything and then walked back to the house. And from the barn, Elias saw the slight change in her shoulders. Not relief exactly, but the easing of something that had been held tightly for a long time. The legal processes moved at legal pace, which was slow. Hardcastle sent weekly updates that were dry and informative and occasionally contained language that suggested even lawyers find land law tedious. The reversionary interest held up to Meridian's initial challenge. Voss, as Elias had predicted, pulled his investment when presented with a full account of the acquisition methods. Elias had written that account himself, detailed and unsparing about his own role, and sent it to Voss in Chicago. And Voss's response had been a terse telegram that said, "I did not know the specifics. I should have," withdrawing immediately, which was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, and it was enough to collapse the financing. Without the investment, Meridian's board had no mechanism to pursue the court challenge. The company entered what Hardcastle described as an organized dissolution in late January, which was a legal term for the process of an enterprise quietly eating itself to avoid a messier end. Elias kept working. He fixed the section of the barn roof that had been holding 3 weeks of accumulated snow with the structural confidence of something that had seen better decades. He repaired a stretch of the east fence that had gone down in a January storm, which he did in temperatures that required him to stop every 40 minutes and warm his hands by the small fire he kept going in a coffee tin near the work site. He cleared a drainage blockage on the north pasture that had been pooling water under the ice in a way that would become a significant problem when the thaw came. He did none of these things announcing them. He did them because they needed doing, and he was capable of doing them, and he was there. Tommy watched all of this with his characteristic quiet attention. On a cold Wednesday evening, when Elias was in the barn doing a final check of the horses before dark, Tommy appeared in the doorway and stood there for a moment. "She's not as angry anymore," he said, "in case you wanted to know." Elias looked up from checking the chestnut mare's left foreleg, which had been slightly tender. "That's between her and me." "I know." Tommy leaned against the doorframe. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying what I see." He paused. "She talks to you different now than she did at the start." "Differently how?" "Like you're a person she's still figuring out instead of a person she's decided about." Elias returned his attention to the mare's leg. "She's not required to figure me out." "No," Tommy agreed. "But she is." "So." He left it there, which was Tommy's way. He said the thing and then walked away from it, leaving you to do whatever you were going to do with it. It was a habit that made him, at 14, considerably wiser than most adults Elias had encountered. The conversation that had been building for weeks, not the confrontation, that was done, but the different kind of conversation, the one that follows a confrontation when two people are still in proximity and still, despite everything, paying attention to each other, came on a night in late January when a storm kept everyone inside and the bunkhouse stove went out at 9 o'clock due to a problem with the flue. Elias was attempting to fix the flue by lamplight when Marin appeared at the bunkhouse door with a coat over her nightclothes and said, "The stove? Flue's blocked. I'll have it cleared in an hour." "The temperature is dropping. Come inside." "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine. Come inside." She was already walking back to the main house, not checking if he was following, which was so characteristic of her that it almost made him smile. He came inside. The kitchen was warm and smelled like the coffee she'd clearly put on the stove when she heard him struggling, because she was that kind of practical and that kind of person even when things were complicated between them. He sat at the table, and she set a cup in front of him and sat down across from him, and it was the first time in weeks that they'd been at that table together at night. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "The Henderson family is coming back," she said. "Dewhurst got a letter. They want the property." "I know. Hardcastle's handling the transfer. The Aldermans won't come back. Pete Alderman's health isn't good for the travel, but Hardcastle says there's a fair compensation offer. A generous one. It should cover what he would have made on the land for several years." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "And the Burtons? Their daughter is coming from Kansas City in the spring. She wants to see the property before she decides." He paused. "She might sell it. To someone else. But not to Meridian and not under duress. That's all I can give her. The choice made freely." Marin was quiet for a moment. The storm pushed against the house in long waves, and the lamp between them moved slightly with the draft that came under the door. "I've been trying to find the right thing to be angry about," she said. "Specifically, because I'm not angry about all of it equally, and I needed to work out what the actual injury was." He waited. "The name," she said. "The false name is the part I keep coming back to. Not because you worked for a company I would have hated, not because you knew things you didn't tell me, but because I asked you your name the first day you came to my yard, and you looked me in the eye and gave me a false one." She met his gaze. "That's the thing that was a choice made in that specific moment, looking at me." "Yes," he said. "It was." "Why?" "Because I was afraid that if I told you who I was, you'd send me away before I could understand what I'd done to this place." "You were afraid," she said, and the words were not quite contemptuous, but they had an edge on them. "Yes. You built a company that targeted vulnerable families based on their financial position, and you were afraid of being turned away from a job." He heard how it sounded. He didn't try to reframe it. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "At least you're not dressing it up." I've been trying not to. I've noticed. She drank her coffee, set the cup down. What I also noticed, and I'm not saying this means what you might hope it means, I'm just saying it as a fact, is that when you found out your past was actively hurting people you were standing next to, you did something about it, at cost to yourself. I'm aware that's the minimum. It's not the minimum, she said. I know men who've done wrong and been faced with the knowledge of it and done nothing at all. Some of them are pillars of their communities. She looked at the table. The minimum is ignoring it. You didn't do the minimum. He was careful about what he said next, because there was something in her voice that required care, not softness, but precision. I don't want you to thank me for it, he said. That's not why I did it. I know it's not. That's why I'm saying it. Outside, the storm peaked in a long, low moan across the roof, and then settled back into its steady rhythm. The lamp held. I'm not ready to trust you the way I trusted you before, she said. I don't know if I can get back there. I want to be honest about that. That's fair. But I'm also not... She stopped, started again, which she almost never did. I'm not interested in making you pay for it indefinitely. That's not productive, and it's not who I want to be. He looked at her across the table. The lines of her face in the lamplight, the way she held herself even when she was tired, the specific kind of honesty she practiced that was harder and more real than anything that passed for honesty in the world he'd come from. What do you need from me? He asked. She considered it seriously, the way she considered everything. Time, she said, and for you to keep doing what you're doing, not for me, for the valley. She looked up. Can you do that without expecting it to mean something between us? Yes, he said, without making it into something I owe you. Yes, she nodded. All right. She stood, took her cup to the counter. The storm should blow through by morning. Dewhurst wants to meet with the remaining Valley ranchers in the first week of February to go over the property reversions. You should be there. Will it help or hurt to have me there? She thought about it honestly. I don't know, but it's your work being presented and you should stand behind it. She moved toward the hallway. Get the flu fixed in the morning. Tommy's been complaining about the cold in the bunkhouse for a week. I'll do it first thing. She stopped at the hallway door. Her back was to him. Callum, she said. It was the first time she'd used that name, his actual name. It landed with the strange weight of something true after a long time of something else. She didn't say anything else. She just stood there for a half-second with his name in the air between them, and then she walked down the hallway to her room, and he sat at the table with the lamp and the sound of the storm until the coffee went cold. The meeting at Dewhurst's office in the first week of February had 12 ranchers in a room built for 6, which meant people stood along the walls and the air got close fast. Elias arrived with Marin and stood near the back while Dewhurst walked through the property reversion process and the current legal status of each parcel. There was noise. Cord Whitmore said something pointed, and several people nodded. A woman named Jessup, whose family had lost grazing rights when the Henderson property was acquired, had questions about whether those rights would be restored with the land transfer, and Elias answered them from the back of the room in the specific legal language required, and the room went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when someone knows exactly what they're talking about. After people filed out into the cold February air in ones and twos, and a few of them looked at Elias with expressions that had shifted from the previous month's versions. Not warmth, mostly, but something different from hostility. The particular look of people who are updating their assessment of a situation and haven't finished yet. Rafael Garza shook his hand on the way out, briefly, firmly, said nothing. That was its own entire statement. Martha Pruitt walked past him last, and she put her small, strong hand on his arm for just a moment and said, "It's a start." He stood in the cold outside Dewhurst's office after everyone had gone, watching the valley under its January-going February sky, bare and cold and unglamorous and entirely itself. No lawyers, no acquisition maps, no vulnerability analyses, just land and the people who worked it and the long argument between the two that defines every piece of ground that's ever been worth fighting for. Marin came to stand beside him. They stood there without speaking, both of them looking out at the same valley, which looked the way it always looked, difficult, impermanent, worth every bit of it. "It's going to take time," she said finally, "for the valley to get back to something stable. Even with the land returned, people don't just... She paused. You don't just put things back and have them be the same. No, he said. You don't. Some of those families are gone for good. Even if the aldermans get their compensation, that land sits empty until someone else builds something on it. That takes years. Yes. So what you did, what you're doing, it's not a restoration. It's more like... She thought for a moment. It's more like stopping the bleeding and leaving the healing to time. He looked at her. She was looking at the valley. That's the most accurate description of it I've heard, he said. She nodded once, not looking at him. Let's go home, she said. The horses need the afternoon feed and Tommy's been doing double work since you were in town. They walked to their horses and rode back toward the Calloway Ranch, side by side on the road, in the cold that was still February cold but had in it, very faintly, so faintly you might not trust it, the particular quality of light that sometimes comes even in the deepest winter and carries in it the distant rumor of something warmer coming. March came in hard and then softened. That was the thing about Wyoming springs. They didn't arrive so much as negotiate, trading cold days for warm ones in a back and forth that kept you from trusting either. The snow on the high peaks stayed, but in the valley the ground began to loosen, and the creek ran full again for the first time since autumn. And the particular smell of thawing earth came back to the mornings like something that had been away on a long trip and returned without fanfare. Elias noticed all of it. He'd become someone who noticed things like that, not in the way of a man cataloging observations, but in the way of someone who'd spent enough time being present in a place that the place had started to matter to him in ways that were difficult to fully articulate. The specific angle of morning light on the east pasture. The way the chestnut mare stood at the fence on warm afternoons, ears forward, like she was waiting for something good to happen. The sound of Tommy splitting wood behind the barn, the rhythm of it steady and competent. He'd been at the Calloway Ranch for 5 months. He'd arrived in autumn as someone else and was leaving, or staying, the question was still open, as himself, which was a transformation that sounded cleaner in the summary than it felt in the living. The Meridian dissolution was finalized in mid-March. Hardcastle sent the paperwork in a thick envelope that arrived at the Tanner Creek post office and that Elias read at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening while Marin went through her spring planting calculations beside him. The language was dry and legal and complete, and what it meant in plain terms was that the land acquisition company he'd spent 3 years building no longer existed in any operational form. He set the papers down. Marin glanced over at them without asking. She could read a document's significance from across a table. "It's done?" she asked. "Done." She looked at him for a moment, then she went back to her calculations. That was all, and it was the right amount. The Henderson family came back in the last week of March. David Henderson was in his 60s, his wife Ruth was a year older, and they drove into the valley in a wagon loaded with what they'd taken with them when they left. Furniture, tools, the things you take when you're planning not to come back but can't quite make yourself believe it. Their daughter rode behind them on a bay horse and watched the valley open up in front of her with the expression of someone who'd spent months telling herself she didn't miss it and had just been proved wrong. Elias helped them unload. He didn't introduce himself right away. He just appeared with his hands available when the heavy pieces needed carrying because that was the most useful thing he could offer and the least presumptuous. David Henderson knew who he was. He'd been told by letter before he made the decision to return. He'd written back to Hardcastle a letter that contained 2 sentences Hardcastle had included in his update to Elias verbatim. "I don't know what to make of a man who builds something like that and then tears it down himself. But the land is the land and I want it back." That afternoon, when the wagon was unloaded and Ruth Henderson was inside her house for the first time in 8 months, moving through rooms with the specific tenderness of someone reacquainting themselves with a space they love, David came to find Elias at the fence he'd been fixing along the Henderson property line. The older man stood there for a moment looking at the fence work. "Good post spacing," he said. "Thank you." "My wife cried when she walked into the kitchen," David said. "She'll deny it." "I won't bring it up." David was quiet. He had the look of a man with something to say who was deciding how to say it. Not a simple decision, given the complicated architecture of what sat between them. "I'm not going to thank you," David said finally, "for the return. Because it was yours to return. You were part of what took it. So there's no credit in giving something back that shouldn't have been taken." "That's correct." Elias said. But, David paused. But I've known enough men who've done wrong and had the chance to make it right and found reasons not to. So, he looked at Elias directly for the first time. You made it right. That's its own thing. He held out his hand. Elias shook it. Neither of them said anything after that. They didn't need to. David walked back to his house, and Elias went back to the fence. And sometimes that's how the important things go. Not with speeches, but with a handshake and two men returning to their work. The gathering happened on a Saturday in the second week of April, and it was Martha Pruitt's idea. She announced it at the post office on a Monday morning with the quiet authority of a woman who'd been in the valley longer than most of the current residents had been alive. And by Tuesday, everyone knew about it. And by Saturday, a dozen families had come together in the open ground behind Martha's property with food and, where available, something to drink. It wasn't a celebration exactly. Nobody called it that. It was more like a collective exhale, the kind of gathering that happens when people who've been tensed against something realize the thing is past and they can unclench. There were children running between the adults' legs, which was its own kind of declaration that the future was still a viable proposition. Carmen Garza was there with the baby, who was several months older now and had developed opinions about everything, including being held by strangers, which he made known clearly. Raphael was talking to David Henderson about cattle breeding with the ease of two men who'd been neighbors before and were becoming neighbors again. Elias stood at the edge of things for most of the morning, not avoiding, just aware that this gathering was not his to occupy the center of, that he was present in it the way a man who has caused damage and worked to repair it is present in the aftermath, accountable and peripheral both. Cord Whitmore came to stand near him at some point in the early afternoon. They hadn't spoken since the confrontation at the general store in December. Whitmore was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades looking at open country in bright light. My water rights issue is still unresolved, Whitmore said. Not as an accusation, as a statement of fact. I know, Elias said. The grazing rights transfer on the North Corridor is in Hardcastle's hands. It's slower because it involves multiple parcels and the county needs to verify each one. Should be resolved by June. Whitmore grunted. Should be. If it's not, tell me. I'll push Hardcastle. Another grunt. Then, my boy's been using that east fence you repaired on the Callaway line as a reference. Says it's the straightest fence in the valley. Elias looked at him. It's a good fence, Whitmore said, which was, from Cord Whitmore, the equivalent of a formal apology and a handshake, and both of them knew it. Martha found him an hour later, near the edge of her south pasture where he'd wandered to get some air and some quiet. You're hovering at the edges, she said. I'm giving people room. There's giving people room, and there's punishing yourself by standing alone in a field. She stopped next to him and looked out at the valley. The people here have made their decisions about you. Most of them are more complicated than either hatred or acceptance, which is the honest version of how people actually feel about things. She paused. Standing in this field doesn't change any of that. I know. Then come back to the gathering. In a minute. She stayed with him for that minute, which stretched into 5, both of them looking at the valley in the April light. The mountains still had their snow. The grass in the lower pastures was coming back in, thin and new and entirely committed to the project of growing. My husband died in February of 1871, Martha said, not as a non sequitur, but as something she'd decided to give him. We'd been on this land for 11 years by then. After he died, I almost sold. Almost. I had a buyer, and I had a price, and I was in Dewhurst's office, the old Dewhurst, this one's father, with a pen in my hand. She paused, and I sat there for about 10 minutes, and then I put the pen down, and I went home, and I've been here every day since. What changed your mind? I looked out his office window at the valley, she said, and I thought about what it would feel like to look at it from somewhere else, knowing I'd let someone else have it for money. She was quiet a moment. Some things you don't sell. Not because of the money, because of what you'd have to become to live with the selling. She patted his arm once, the same way she had after the meeting at Dewhurst's. Then she walked back to her gathering. He stood there a moment longer. Then he followed. The conversation he'd been circling for months happened that evening, not dramatically, not with preparation, but the way most real things happen, when both people are tired enough to stop being careful. They were riding back from Martha's in the late afternoon. The kind of light that is gold and horizontal and makes everything look considered. Tommy had ridden ahead and was already at the barn by the time they reached the Calloway gate. Marin slowed her horse at the gate, and he slowed beside her, and they sat there on their horses for a moment looking at the ranch. The fence lines were straight. The barn roof was sound. The water trough was full, and the supply was clean. None of these things were metaphors. They were just true. And they were true because of work that had been done, and the work had been done by a man trying to earn back something he'd known from the start he might not be able to earn back. "I've been thinking about the spring planting," Marin said. "I know, I saw your calculations. I want to expand this kitchen garden, put in another half-acre on the south side of the house, but I need the ground broken and composted before May." She looked at him sidelong. "That's a lot of work for two people and a 14-year-old. "It is," he said. "I could use a third hand, someone who knows what they're doing with a spade and isn't afraid of early mornings." He looked at her. She was looking at the ranch, not at him, which was both characteristic and deliberate. "Are you offering me a job?" he asked. "I'm noting that there's work that needs doing and you're capable of doing it. That's not quite the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him directly, in the way she did when she was done being indirect about something. "I'm not the same person I was before December," she said. "I want you to understand that. I don't mean that badly. I mean that what happened changed how I see things, including you, and I can't unknow what I know, and I'm not sure I'd want to because some of what I know is—" She stopped, started again. "Some of what I know is that you're capable of more honesty than most people I've met, when you're not being a coward about it." "That's a complicated compliment." "It's an accurate one." She held his gaze. "I'm not ready to trust easily. I may not get back to easy trust, but I'm not interested in living my life at a distance from everyone because one person, or one version of one person, was dishonest with me." She looked back at the ranch. "I've watched you work for 5 months. I know what your work looks like. I know what you do when you think no one's watching, and I know what you do when things go wrong, and I know how you treat Tommy and how you spoke to Rafael Garza the day he came with the mortgage news, and how you stood in that store in December and let Cord Whitmore say what he said without defending yourself." "I wasn't going to defend myself." "I know you weren't. That's what I'm saying." She looked at her hands on the reins. "There are two versions of who you are. The version I met, which was false, and the version I've watched since, which I believe is true. I'm choosing to weigh the second one more than the first." She paused. "Not because the first doesn't matter, but because I think the second one is what the first one was trying to become." The valley was very quiet around them. The horses stood still, both of them placid in the evening air, entirely uninterested in the weight of the conversation happening on their backs. "I want to stay," he said. "If that wasn't clear." It was clear. "And I want to be honest with you about everything, including the things that are still uncomfortable to say." "I'd prefer that," she said. "The other way is worse." "Yes," he said. "I know that now." She looked at him again with those dark, precise eyes, and what he saw in them was not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness was a clean word for something that was actually gradual and ongoing, and would require more time than either of them could predict. What he saw was something more like decision. The particular look of a person who has considered something from every angle and chosen, with clear eyes and no illusions, to proceed. "Stay then," she said, "and fix that south bed before May or we won't have it ready for planting." She rode through the gate into the yard, and he followed, and Tommy came out of the barn and took both horses with the routine efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for months and expected to keep doing it. The days that followed were not the end of difficulty. That would be dishonest to say. The Whitmore grazing rights took until late May to resolve, and there were 2 weeks in there when it looked like the paperwork might stall permanently, and Elias rode to Tanner Creek 3 times in 10 days, pushing Hardcastle's office with the kind of persistence that bordered on aggravating. The alderman compensation took longer than expected because Pete Alderman's health made communication slow and irregular, and there was 1 week when Elias wasn't sure the man was still alive, and the uncertainty sat on him in a way that didn't let him sleep well. Tommy turned 15 in April, and Marin made a cake that was imperfect in the way of cakes made by someone who is an excellent cook but not a baker, and Elias gave him a good quality folding knife that the boy accepted with the restrained pleasure of someone trying not to show how much they liked it. And they ate the imperfect cake at the kitchen table, and Tommy talked more than he usually did, which was its own gift. The ground broke for the south bed in the third week of April. It was hard work. The soil had rocks in it that weren't visible until the spade found them, and some of them were significant, requiring the iron bar and considerable argument before they came free. Marin worked beside him every morning until noon, which she announced was the time she needed to spend on the books and the correspondence, and which Elias respected as a boundary and also privately suspected was partly about pacing herself because she was too stubborn to admit when her back was tired. They talked while they worked, about the planting schedule, about the water rotation for summer, about Tommy's future and whether there was money to send him to a proper school in the fall, about small things and not small things, in the unguarded way you talk when your hands are busy and you're not looking at each other. Some conversations are easier sideways. He told her more about Denver, about the years building Meridian, not to explain himself into innocence, but because she'd asked. In the straightforward way she asked everything, and because he'd promised honesty, and honesty wasn't selective. She listened without interrupting, which was her way, and asked questions that were precise and sometimes uncomfortable, which was also her way. "Did you know," she asked one morning, "when you were building it, that it would end up like this?" He thought about it honestly. "I knew the pressure tactics were going to hurt people. I told myself the people had a choice. They could sell or not sell. I told myself market forces were not the same as coercion." He set a rock aside. "I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong, and I kept going anyway, which is different from not knowing." She dug for a moment in silence. That took something to say. Not as much as it should have. She looked at him then, with the morning light on her face, and a smear of good dark soil on her forearm, and her expression was the one he'd come to know best. Not soft, not hard, but honest. The look of someone who sees clearly and chooses to stay anyway. By May, the south bed was planted. By June, Whitmore's grazing rights were resolved, and the man showed up at the Callaway fence one morning to tell Elias directly, which was not something he'd been obligated to do, and which Elias recognized as the completion of something that had started in a general store in December. The Henderson property had livestock on it again. The Garza baby had started pulling himself upright on the furniture and looked, according to Carmen in a letter to Marin, absolutely furious about everything, which Carmen reported with the proud exhaustion of a mother who had gotten through the first hard year. Martha Pruitt's land sat on its hill above the south end of the valley, exactly as it always had, because some things in the world simply continue, and that continuity is its own form of victory. The summer came in earnest in July. Hot, dry, demanding. And the work it required was the work it always required, which was all of you, every day, without negotiation. Elias gave it that. He gave it that not because he was performing redemption for an audience, but because the work was real, and the land was real, and the people on it were real. And those things had become the things that structured his days and his purposes in a way that the Denver offices and the mahogany tables and the numbers in the acquisition files had never managed to be. There's a thing that happens to some people who've lived at a distance from their own conscience for a long time. When they finally close that distance, when they finally stop running a separate account on the person they're pretending to be, the relief of it is so large it takes a while to understand what it actually is. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels more like setting down something you'd carried so long you'd stopped noticing the weight. And once you've set it down, you can't quite believe how heavy it was, and you can't quite believe how long you carried it. And the honest answer to why you carried it that long is not a flattering one. Callum Ashford had carried it for years. He'd carried it through the building of Meridian and the growth of it, and the moment he finally walked out the door in Denver, and he'd carried it all the way to a frontier valley in Wyoming, where a woman he had no right to trust him had offered him honest work for $12 a month. He'd been setting it down in pieces ever since, and it was not done, and might not be for a long time, and that was the honest accounting of it. One evening in late July, when the heat of the day was finally releasing and the sky over the mountains had gone that deep particular blue that comes just before the stars, Marin came and sat on the fence beside where he was working on the last section of the North Pasture extension. She sat on the top rail with her arms crossed, watching him work, which she sometimes did and which he'd stopped finding unusual. "Tommy asked me this morning," she said, "whether you were going to stay through the fall." He looked up. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to ask you." "He didn't ask me." "He's 15. He's not going to ask you directly." She looked at the mountains. He worries about people leaving. It's a history he has. Elias was quiet for a moment, driving a post with steady measured strikes. I'm staying through the fall, he said. And after? He set the mallet down and looked at her on the fence. The straight back, the practical clothes, the way she looked at things directly even when they were difficult. What do you want the answer to be? He asked. She looked at him for a long moment in the evening light. I want the true one, she said. That's all I've ever wanted. Then, I'm staying, he said. Not through the fall. I'm staying. She held his gaze. Something in her face, not softened, not transformed, but settled. The expression of someone who has made a decision and feels the rightness of it not as joy but as solidity, ground that holds. All right, she said. She got down from the fence and walked back toward the house, and the last light of July moved across the valley in long horizontal lines, and the grass in the new pasture extension was thin but growing, and the fence he was building was straight, and the creek ran clear all the way from the northern hills, unobstructed now, finding its way where it was always supposed to go. He picked up the mallet and went back to work. That is the thing about the frontier, and perhaps about most places, and perhaps about most lives, that nobody tells you when you're young and building things for the wrong reasons. What you make with your hands matters less than who you become while making it. The land was still there when the companies came for it. It was still there when they failed. It would be there after all of them were gone. What changes is not the land but the people, what they choose to defend, and what they're willing to sacrifice to defend it, and whether, when they've done wrong, they find the nerve to stand in it and do the harder thing. Callum Ashford, who had arrived as Elias Mercer and left the name behind when he left the lie behind, drove the last post of the season as the stars came out over Wyoming, and the light stayed on in the main house. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote made its dry, unhurried comment about the night, and the valley was quiet and imperfect and entirely, stubbornly alive.